Okay, good evening. We'll start the lecture. So if you're able to hear me, can you give me some response? Oh, thank you very much. This is the last lecture, so my intention is to give a very short summary of what we have delivered in this course, and also spend some time briefing you about the online examination. Perhaps I will spend quite some time on briefing you about the examination, because I understand most of you may not have taken online examination before, at least some of you. And we have a number of things that you need to take note of. And I will also make contingency in case there are some complication in the process of the examination. So perhaps I'll also leave you some time after my briefing so that you can ask some question either on the course or on the examination, so as to clarify some of your confusion and also to reassure you about the process. Okay, this is a course what we call the contemporary issue of housing and urban management. As I mentioned in the first section of this course, this is the first years we restructure the whole course, because in the past we only concentrate on housing management, but because of the change in the program structure, and now we need to inject some element of urban management into that. So because it's the first year, perhaps there may be something that we haven't been doing very well. So I would appreciate if you can give us some suggestion and feedback so that we can improve. So what do we mean by housing and urban management? In fact, we started with the very basic second unit in our society. We call it households. And in fact, households in modern society, they live in some kind of housing, either in most of the context of countries in the world, they are houses, independent houses. Whereas in this part of the world, particularly in Hong Kong and many big cities in mainland China, most people will live in flats. But those flats, and particularly those flats, they are being organized in buildings. And in Asian cities, particular cities in China, those buildings, in fact, they are being organized in the form of neighborhood. And above the neighborhood, there are some governmental administrative unit, what we call the district. So Hong Kong have district, Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities have districts. Although how the district is being organized is very different in different cities. And the biggest unit we have interest on is the city. Although what is above the city is also have some interest in our urban management studies, but they are of a more or less a secondary importance on that. So in the first part of this course, we'll concentrate more on the buildings and the neighborhood, what previously we referred to as housing or property management, how to manage the building and also how to manage the neighborhood. But later on, when we unfold our discussions, in fact, management of the buildings is extended to the management of neighborhood, which is more than the management of the buildings. So there's something more we have to do on the neighborhood. And perhaps this is also very special in some cities in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong and cities in mainland China. Whereas the districts and cities, in particular the cities, are the main focus of our urban management concern. So we concern how the city is being managed, but some sub-region of the city, what we call district, sometimes may also be our concern. So with this in mind, in fact, we need to take into the consideration of the context of our studies. Because when cities and housing is concerned, they are involved in a very complex structure and interaction. And that applies to housing and city in general. Whereas in cities in China, in mainland China, in Hong Kong, there are additional complexities. Some general consideration of housing and cities, particularly housing, because housing is itself a complex good. So housing has sort of different sort of attributes. And we relied on housing to fulfill various aspects of our life. And from the very basic need about shelter to the enjoyment of the amenity provided by housing, and also by the facilities that are provided by the neighborhood, and also about the location of the neighborhood in connecting to other locations. So these are the various aspects of housing as a complex good, because it fulfills different aspects of our need. And when housing is concerned, it's also composite. Composite in the way that because housing is not just something that we relied on for shelter and also to enhance our quality of life. And housing is also being used firstly as a tool for investment. So it's keeping the value of our wealth. So that is more than just taking housing as something in use. So that we differentiate what we call the use value of housing and the investment value of housing. And housing is not just for investment. It could be an instrument to reflect or to express our status and also our individuality. So this makes housing a little bit more complex than other kind of commodity. Even they have the use value and they have the exchange value, what we call the investment value. Housing is more than that because it has some social value. And the distribution of housing is also more than a housing per se, because when housing is being clustered in neighborhood, it expresses its own characteristic. So the summation of housing quality, the residents in the housing will express the characteristic of the whole neighborhood or the whole district. And various distribution of residents with different backgrounds would also have an impact on some attribute of the city. Take, for example, segregation. Segregation, in fact, has a close connection with the housing quality, the residents who live in that housing, but more important is the distribution of the housing. So that is what we call housing is a composite. And there's an additional element of that composite good is what we call a merit good. Because unlike ordinary commodities, most societies have some kind of minimal standard of housing, and beyond which the society will have the consensus to subsidize the difference between the minimum standard of housing and the actual enjoyment of housing and an individual household is enjoying. So that is something what we call merit good. So this is the sort of policy basis for the development of public housing. And in Hong Kong, in cities in mainland China, another dimension of housing or how housing is being distributed would have an impact on how a city is being managed. We refer to the density of the city. Density of the cities, in fact, is about the distribution of housing. And in Hong Kong in particular, another dimension is about the scale. And this is also an issue in many sort of big Chinese cities. Not only is housing being packed, and it's also being developed in a very dense way. And this density is become even more complicated because the scale of the neighborhood is big. Unlike in many cities in the West or in other Asian cities, even if they have high density, the scale of the development is not big. So they are consisted of individual buildings, although they're packed together. Whereas in Chinese cities and in some Asian cities as well, the scale of the development is big because that neighborhood will be organized as a totality which have the sort of power in replacing local government in the provision of public services. And this would have a profound impact on how the neighborhood and in fact the cities are being managed. And because of the large scale and also because of the high density, there have been created some common area within the building and also within the neighborhood. And this context will give even more complexity to how the building, the neighborhood, and the cities being managed. Because we are not just talking about the management of the building or the property. We are talking about the management of the whole neighborhood. In most cities, in fact, these are the purview of the city. So these are in the form of the provision of public services. So the neighborhood are being managed by the local government. But whereas when those sort of buildings, they are grouped together in a planned neighborhood with a big scale and with a large area of common areas, so that those areas which usually are being managed by the local government, the city government in other cities, are being managed by the private so-called owners of the neighborhood. And because of this complexity, the governing structure of the building and the neighborhood, because of the scale, because of the high density, because of the existence of a large area of common areas, are becoming more complicated. So you need a more sophisticated governance structure in pursuing the management of the building and also of the neighborhood. And associating with that governance structure are the specialized skills that you need to manage the buildings and the neighborhood. And that need to organize that special skills give rise to a professional workforce, what we call professional property manager, housing managers, in pursuing this sort of task of managing a complex neighborhood with a sophisticated governing structure. And with this in mind, in fact, our course will basically adopt an analytic framework, what we call a social constructivist so-called approach, in identifying the issues, analyzing the problems with different dimensions. So we're concerned about the structural origin basis of the management system. So whether it is a neoliberal regime, which is a free democracy, or this is of authoritarian regime who have an impact on how the cities and the neighborhood is being managed. But within that so-called structural context, we can set up different institutions. So we mentioned a number of institutions, how the neighborhood are being organized, how the ownership are being organized. So that can be in the form of cooperative, in the form of share ownership, lease holdings, or in the form of condominium. And the management can be carried out by agents within the institutional setup in different organization forms. Take, for example, Hong Kong has a very big public housing sector, which is managed by one single organization, the housing department or the housing authority. But in the operation, they outsource that to private property management company. Whereas in other parts of the world, for instance, in Europe, those public sectors housing, they are managed by a larger number but smaller housing company. Whereas in the private sectors, in fact, we also have the institutional setup of big developer who have a control on a large-scale neighborhood and also have power dominance within the system of a property-based governing system. So that the organization of those property management, unlike in many parts of the world, which are mostly small company, the organization structure of private property management company are big, and most of them have close connection with the developer. And we also have an institutional system, what we call a deed of mutual confidence, manager, so that they can enjoy the monopoly in the service contract, and to sack them is extremely difficult for big projects. In operational forms, there are also many they take many forms. What we have mentioned is about how those resources in the public sector is being managed, or the behavior of the tenants being controlled. And because of the limited time, limited section we can have, we are unable to touch on what we call the intersubjectivity in the housing and urban management, which we use to talk about professional and professionalism. With this framework in mind, in fact, we have divided our lectures into three main themes. One is about the context, the other is about housing management, and the other is about urban management. So within housing management, within the context, we started with an overview of what we offer and the basic analytic framework. Although we may not be able to carry out the framework throughout every lectures, but we will try to fit this framework into the lecture, so that we analyze the structure and the institutional origin and basis of cities and housing management. And we also started with the description of the system about land, about housing ownership in Hong Kong and mainland China, so that you can have a better understanding about the legal and the structural basis of the management system that will be developed. Within the theme on housing management, we start with the governance of private sector housing. So it's not just about managing housing, it's about managing the neighborhood. We fit those analyses into the concept of collective action. Because setting up a governance structure is important in how we set up the organization and also how we carry out the operations of housing management in the private sector. But we would say that the most important issues in the governance of private housing management is about how we organize the cooperation of owners in making decisions. And in this aspect, we are not talking about the ad hoc cooperations between owners. We talk about the more institutional setup of the owners, how to organize themselves into organizations that are able to realize the ownership and the management rights, as well as to organize decision-making and to supervise those professionals who carry out the actual management work. So this is a problem what we frame as collective action. So we will be able to borrow or to rely on the theories and the concepts that are developed elsewhere to analyze how the operations and the organization in property management and neighborhood management works. So we specifically address the solution of collective action. But of course, before that, we have highlighted the nature of collective action as pinpoint in the game theory. So that cooperation under some assumption about human nature and also assumption about human interactions, cooperation is not a natural phenomenon. So any cooperation needs to be explained. And in fact, the cooperation is the result of man-made institutional structure. So there are several solutions that we can install to overcome the intrinsic difficulties in getting people to cooperate, to make decisions, and to carry out action. So first we introduce the individual approach that rely on either what we call the selective incentive, or it's about using norms and customs to organize people's action. But these are very special solutions which may not be enduring. So we introduce another solution, what we call a market solution. So when we take the management of the neighborhood as a special kind of collective action, or a special kind of goods and services, so that if we can create some or transform the housing management operations into some special forms, we may be able to install what we call a market approach in solving the collective action dynamic. So this is what we call the clubwood approach. So we organize the neighborhood services, we organize the property management services in the form of clubwood provision. But this kind of market approach has its limitation, and it would not work under some condition. Or we should say in an opposite way. The market solution, the clubwood solution will only work if they fulfill some prerequisites. So if those prerequisites doesn't exist, the clubwood solution will not work. So that's why in Hong Kong, we have a lot of what we call free node buildings, in which the market solution which work in a lot of public housing neighborhoods would not work in those buildings. So perhaps we need another solution, what we call institutional approach in common pool resources. So taking neighborhood governance, neighborhood services provision, property management service provision as a provision of common goods. And the study of the service provision, ownership structure, decision-making structure of other natural resources will give us some hints how to set up such an operation in governing structure to deliver neighborhood services and property management services. And we extend this discussion into mainland China, with the market approach, institutional approach works. But in addition, there are extra complications in the setup of governing structure and in the pursuing of operation of neighborhood management because of the political context of China and also because of the operation of the state in the neighborhood. So that property management will be more than a market approach, or the management of the neighborhood will be more than the management of common pool resources, because of the local state perceive themselves having a high stake in the management of the neighborhood. In fact, because of there is a apparent overlapping about how decision is being made in the neighborhood and how the operation of services are being delivered in the neighborhood, because of the existence of some local political concern or local political control within the neighborhood. And this would make the installation of the institution in governing in neighborhood governance more complicated. And because of the complication, it creates some kind of contradiction and conflict. So that is one special characteristic about neighborhood governance in mainland China. Whereas in the public sectors, we have introduced, to start with, some special need housing and some need to manage the special housing, and also about shaping the behavior of the tenants, and also about managing resources in the public housing sector. Whereas for the focus of urban management, we concern about urban planning, and we also concern about the development and the creation of smart city. So in the governing structure of the private sector, we begin with the collective action dynamic because we frame the problem of delivery of neighborhood governance and neighborhood services as a problem of free rider, so that it creates collective action dynamic and it results in the discussion of market and institutional solution. And the housing and neighborhood governance would trigger a political sensitivities in neighborhood governance in China. So property management, neighborhood governance, or in providing neighborhood services in other parts of the world, including Hong Kong, is purely an economic activity. Whereas in China, it has been perceived as a political activity because of the propensity of the homeowners association in mobilization. Whereas in China, because of its authoritarian state characteristic, we still regard mobilization as the monopoly power of the state. So that any organization that have potential capacity in mobilizing their members will be regarded as sensitive. And the local state will try their best to put surveillance on those organizations, try to preempt them from exercising those powers of mobilization. So that's also the origin of the conflict in some neighborhood in mainland China because of this sort of contradiction. Whereas in the public sector, our management concern will focus on the delivery of housing as merit good. so that a materialization of those merit goods is the provision of public and social housing. So that we mention about the management of special need housing, which include what we call the transition housing. Whereas in the public sectors, because of there are so many issues we can discuss, and because of the limited time we have, I have only sort of pinpoint sort of two areas about shaping tenants' behavior. Although it may not be the most important issues in the eyes of the housing manager in the public sector, but from a city or urban management perspective, and this is an areas that will enable us to connect a discussion to other important issues in urban management. For instance, the exercise of power in town planning, and also about the potential risk of being sort of watch a point by the big brothers in the creation of smart city. So shaping tenants' behavior will touch on the subtle use of power in controlling the behavior of the public tenant in a subtle way and also in an unconscious way. Because of this connection, that's the reason why we picked this topic as a discussion. And the other topic is about managing resources in allocating the housing resources of housing units, and also about the finance of public housing. First, on the urban management side, we started with the discussion in smart city. We introduced different, more conventional perspective in looking at so-called smart city, about the top-down approach, the bottom approach, but we focus more on some sort of modern expression of smart city. Smart city can be discussed from a perspective of the installation of technologies, particularly what we call the ICT in cities, and to collect big data information to run the city. But in this course, our focus is more on the more private side of the creation of smart city. Take, for example, the sharing economy. And sharing economy also creates some sort of new elements in organizing resources, in organizing interaction in the cities, what we call platformatization. And the creation of platforms is increasingly sort of becoming important, not just in the delivery of services, but also in shaping people's behavior, in shaping people's so-called customs, in catering, in retails, and also their interaction with sort of other parts of the society. And lastly, we also introduce urban planning, but we focus on the power dimension in urban planning. Particularly, we focus on the public interest in urban planning, but also how we perceive that public interest in urban plannings are sort of being realized. So the more traditional approach is what we call the summative sort of approach. So that has some assumption and also would match with these systems in most Western democracy about representative democracy. So that These are the experts, the elected officials who have the power to to summarize and also to balance the interests of different sections of the society to arrive at a plan that will take into the consideration the interests of most so-called individuals in the city. But this has been criticized as a myth because the summative approach will, although apparently, will take into consideration the interests of the majority of people in the city. But in the process, in fact, it may bias towards those who are more vocal, and also those who have closer connection with the power center, the decision-making center, so that perhaps their voice will be heard more than those who are at the grassroots, who are powerless, but who are mostly affected by the change in urban planning. So another approach that's being advocated, what we call a communicative approach, we take into consideration with more communication with the society, particularly those people in the neighborhood or people who are mostly affected by the change in urban planning. And with that, in fact, there is also a associated structure of those planning systems. So for the summative, it connects more to what we call the pluralist approach in running the city, which emphasize on the participation, so as to say. So that with the participation of people, we are able to summarize their views, try to summarize and balance interests. So these two, the summative and the participatory structure, they are interrelated. Again, this participatory system may be regarded as a myth by some critics because of the same reason. Participation is not equal. Participation will rely on various attributes and characteristics of the group and individuals. So some are more representative than the others. But whereas those stakeholders, they may not be equally being represented, so the participation, in fact, may not work or may not be so efficient. Particularly sufferings are those who are at the bottom of the society, who are not being represented, or who are being weak in the participatory structure. So there's another approach, what we call the insurgents approach. So that to recognize the imbalance of power. So you need to have a more radical and more innovative, imaginative approach, not to follow the very traditional participatory and summative approach. So that with more imagination, with more communication with the grassroots, or perhaps the interests of those powerless or those at the grassroots are being more protected than the traditional system. So these are what we have covered. I have to confess that as the first year, we may not be totally successful in integrating different portions of the lecture, but we try to have some themes that can echo with each other. Take, for example, the institutional setup in the private management may echo some of the institutional setup in the development of smart city. The political elements and the power elements in the political and social implication about homeowners association in mainland China and also about shaping the behavior of tenants may echo that of the so-called power discussion in our urban planning. Hope next year we can have more coordinations and we can so-called deliver that in a more comprehensive and what we call a more efficient way in so-called adding so-called more additive elements to different lectures. So in this aspect, in fact, we will welcome your suggestions and your feedback. So you can give me emails, you can write it on the chat box afterwards so that I can take this into account on that. So I stop here for a minute and see whether you have anything you would like to raise about the course, about the individual lectures. Because the rest of the lecture, I will brief you about the examination. Okay, understand that because most of you may be more anxious about the examination, particularly when the examination is being held online. So there may be a number of risk and uncertainty. So first of all, the examination will be held next Friday from 6:30, and it will last for 2 hours. And you have to take it online. So I've already set up two sections for practice. One is to practice what we call the device 1, the lockdown browser, and the other is about device 2, your mobile device with a camera that will suit the environment of the online examination. So altogether, we have set 6 questions, and you are asked to answer 2. So we will not divide the question into sections. So you are free to choose any 2 from that 6. So in the examination, it's just like writing a long essay. So there are several elements we will ask, not necessarily all, it can be a combination. So firstly, you must know the concepts and the related theories. So perhaps even if we haven't asked, if there is a connection with concept and theory, we'll expect you to describe it. So simply mention the concept and the theory without defining, without showing your understanding, will be pointless. So it will not score you anything if you only mention about the terms, but you have not explained the concept and the theory. In some question, we may explicitly ask you to define concept and theory, but in other question we may not. But that is an implicit expectation that whenever there are related concept and theories, you must show your understanding, even if the question haven't explicitly asked. So with that concept and theory, we will not only require you to define, because this is just a test of memory. So we will ask you to analyze and or to apply. So with the concept, the theories, you must show that you are able to apply those theories in your analysis. And if possible, with illustration or example, any example, unless the questions explicitly circumscribe the illustration of the example you have to use. Or otherwise, analyze with example and illustration is always desirable. So I've just mentioned, it is a long question. So you must write in complete sentence in paragraph form. But in case you are short of time because of your poor time planning, it is always more desirable if you write in point form, but you are able to express more of your idea. Then you continue to write in paragraph form, but you are only able to express limited ideas. So perhaps it's some kind of trick. Of course, the most desirable form is in the form of paragraph and complete sentence. I just mentioned that if you are rushed, you have to rush. Then write down the points without elaboration may score a little bit higher than writing just a portion of your argument, but in a complete sentence and paragraph. And also, we are not expect you to have full reference on that. But of course, I mean, if you have full reference on that, it may be marginally sort of desirable, although it's not compulsory, because we understand that it's already very good if you can recall those arguments in the literature, because it is pointless if you recall the wrong citation or the wrong reference, unless you are pretty certain about the source of reference of some particular theories or a quotation. And we do not encourage you to memorize those citations. Don't try to memorize, but try to understand. When you understand, you may be able to recall, not word by word, but the underlying meaning of that. That is more important. So that's the reason why we do not need full citation or full reference on that. Because it is a long question, you need planning. So usually we will encourage or advise you to spend about 5 minutes, 10 minutes before you write any questions to have a planning. And because we need a structure, what we mean a structure is we are not counting the sort of the points that you have pitched right. We need a logic. We need a logic from definition to theories, to illustration, and also to conclusion. So the same way as you write your essay or your term paper. So even if you're in a rush, do not just randomly so put down the points. Although I mentioned previously that you can write in point forms, but I don't mean that in point form I just check whether the point that match with sort of my expectation. It's not. The point form itself has to express some kind of logic of an argument using theories and concepts, and then engage in analysis and to draw a conclusion. So we expect explicit argument on that. So it's the same kind of argument we will expect in your term paper. It's exactly the same. So don't just so-called memorize all the points you are able to memorize and just put it down in random. When it's just put it down in random, in fact, it's counterproductive. You will get less points, less marks, in fact, because that is an expression that you don't understand, you just memorize. And we do not encourage sort of memorization. We encourage understanding. So as I just mentioned previously, even if the question does not ask for illustration, so illustration is always desirable. I mean, illustration is about the application in some case, in some real life situation. Gives you some idea of the type of question. These are perhaps the question that we have a lot of words. We may say question of this type. Take, for example, we ask you to define those possible organization forms. Ownership, leaseholding, cooperative, and condominium as institutional solution. And then we need you to apply those definition, because you already know the characteristic, the assumptions, and also the basis of those organizations. So why they are popular in Hong Kong? Why condominium is popular in Hong Kong, but not other form of the organization in neighborhood governance. So this is a so-called one form of question. Explicitly ask you to define, explicitly ask you to analyze, but some are more subtle. We haven't covered green facility management, but we covered it a few years ago. So it's also another common type. We create a statement and ask you to discuss. Then you need to think about what concept, what theories that are associated with a statement, which you need to define, and what illustration you need to develop in order to echo the discussion in those sort of statements. So you need to have some stance about the statement. But of course, we always treasure critical review. So even if you have a stand, take for example, green facilities management is the best way. So that is your conclusion. But at least you need to argue against that. So these are the potential weakness, is that the risk. But having taken those arguments about the risk and the potential weakness, there's still some positive side of this statement. So that's a conclusion, but you need to argue in such a way. So it's not just a one-sided presentation about the strength. You also have to critically look at this weakness. But in balance, why the strength will overshadow the weakness, so that that's still the best way. Of course, I mean, in reality, we need to make a decision. But in making such a decision, we need to realize the shortage, the weakness, the limitation, and also the risk that are involved of a particular approach or a particular policy or program. About the format, because the online examination may not be a sort of very common experience of most of you, so that I need to sort of brief you about some kind of details. But of course, I mean, you can ask me questions and allow me to clarify some of the confusion you have. First, I have mentioned that you need two devices. The first one is perhaps your notebook computer or your desktop computer, that what we call a device one. And that is the device you use to attempt the exam, type in your questions. So you need to invoke lockdown browser, and after that you go into Canvas. In the Canvas, there's a quiz section. In the quiz section, there is an entry what they call online examination. So just like taking your practice examination, click into that, and then it will lead you to the exam question. And we'll ask you to log in your device one at least 15 minutes before that. Your device 2 is either your mobile phone, your iPad, or another computer that have a camera. So with that device, you log into Zoom, and there's already a link there. I set up a Zoom section. So you have to set up your camera to be able to shoot your keyboard, your hands, and part of the screen. So you have already practiced it in the sort of practice section. So you just record it. So we also monitor and ask you to modify it if you forget and if you put it in the wrong position. Because that device is used to monitor the process to prevent you from, or to illustrate that you have not been cheating. And if you use a mobile phone, if you know how to do this, capture it in the landscape mode, because it will give us a wider view of that. But remember to turn off the fixed aspect function of your mobile phone. So you can test if you turn your mobile phone 90 degrees, you have a wide screen. That is called a landscape. And if you are able to get that landscape mode, you haven't locked your aspect. So you are able to rotate your image. So I encourage all of you to test that. Because if you set it there, we can have a wider view of you, of your environment. And you have to turn on the camera of that second device all the time. And we'll check you. So perhaps we will stop you if you deliberately turn off your camera, because we have that information on Zoom. Even if your camera may be blank out because of the internet connection, but Zoom will indicate whether you have turned on your camera or turn off your camera. So we will caution you if you accidentally turn off your camera. But if you ignore our cautions and our warning, we may terminate your examination, because there's some risk involved. So remember to use either your earphone to monitor the voice in Zoom, or you turn on the volume of your device 2 to a higher level so that you can listen to our announcement, because we will make any announcement in your device 2. The first announcement is to ask you to show your student ID card for inspection. Or if you want to use brand paper for draft, you need to get permission. And the permission have to be sold while your ID is being checked. So show your ID, show your brand paper, and ask for permission from the invigilator. And they will tell you whether they have inspect your ID and also inspect your term paper. And please do not shout out to get permission, because if you can imagine, if 10 or even 5 students shout out, it will be very chaotic. We will make the announcement on Zoom on that. So remember to turn on the volume of that. And when you go to the quiz section, the exam paper will be locked. It will be released at exactly 6:30. And once you click start, the clock will begin to click. And you have exactly 120 minutes. And after 120 minutes, the system will automatically submit the paper for you. And the paper is also protected by a passcode. The passcode will be announced in the announcement section at 6:27. So remember that code and enter into the quiz section to start your exam. And we follow the rules of face-to-face or in-person examination. So after 30 minutes after the start of the examination, you are not allowed to take the examination. We only count the login to the Zoom system and the Canvas system on that. So remember to log in at least before 7 o'clock. While the exam will be 2 hours, and you will not be allowed to leave within the first hour. But if you finish early, you can leave anytime after the first hour. When you leave before 8:35, do not shout out or ask for confirmation about the submission. Usually, the submission will not be problematic, even if you haven't clicked the submit button. What you have written in the quiz will be automatically saved periodically. I think it's every few minutes. So the most you have lost is just about five minutes. So don't worry about that. The system works in such a way, unless there is problem with your internet connection. So that can be something chaotic. So do not ask for confirmation about your submission. But to assure you, in fact, we will show you the successful submission list after the exam ends. So at 20:35. So we can show you those successful submission. But usually you don't have to worry, because even if you haven't submitted, your answer will not be lost, So any communication, you have to do it via the chat box of Zoom. Do not use your microphone because it will create nuisance. There are a few of you who may not have a quiet and secure venue for the examination, and they ask to take the examination on campus. I'm doing the arrangement on that. I'm booking a venue so that you can go to that room to take your examination. But there will not be any invigilator. The invigilator will still be online. So even if you have to go back to the campus to take the online examination, you still have to use the 2 devices. So there will not be any invigilation on the venue. So there may be a few of you who sit in that room. It's usually a small classroom, so that you can have a better internet connection and also a more quiet place to do your examination. I'll make an announcement within these few days, because I'm still clearing some operation of that. So just in case your lockdown browser doesn't work, you need to inform the invigilator via Zoom, so that we can stop counting your time, because we can give you more time, in fact, afterwards, to compensate your loss of time because of the lockdown browser problem. So you need to inform us immediately. And in such case, you need to restart lockdown browser, or in some cases, you even have to reboot your computer. And our experience tells us, even if you have reboot your computer and re-enter Canvas, the information will be there because they have already been saved in the cloud so that you can continue. You do not have to start from the beginning, so don't worry. Unless you have internet connection problem. If you don't, it's just about crashing your lockdown browser. The most your loss is about maybe 5 minutes or 6 minutes of your time, so that you can reclaim most of your answer. So because you have already reported that, so we can give you extra time as compensation. So don't worry. But in case if your Zoom wouldn't work, you have to ring up the invigilator with that telephone so that you report your problem. But the worst scenario will be your internet connection failed. And that may be an issue for those who are in some special venues, because I understand from the very simple surveys we have, some of you may be in a quarantine hotel, and the quarantine hotel may not have very good internet connection. But don't worry, unless there's no internet connection, if the connection is just on and off and it's not that stable, you don't have to worry, because after you reconnect, you can get all the information from the cloud. But if you have that issues, you better inform us so that we may be able to give you more time to compensate for that interruption. So in case your internet connection fails, if you are still able to work on your lockdown browser and Canvas, continue doing that. And those information will be stored locally in your computer. And once the internet connection resumes, they will be uploaded to the cloud. In case the internet connection would not resume, but you are still able to work in your computer and store the information locally, don't go away. Use your camera, your mobile phone camera, to take a picture of what you have written. But to make sure that the text you have entered is legible. So perhaps you may have to have some kind of a close-up and take more pictures so that you can capture your full essay. I know it's complicated, but there is just some contingency. The worst case is your computer doesn't work. So I would suggest you can take a picture of the questions at the very start, so that if your computer doesn't work, you can still write your answer on a piece of paper. And after that, take a picture of that piece of paper and email to me. But I'll ask you to take it within 15 minutes after 2 hours of the start of your entries into the quiz. We have that record, so we can take that. In case 15 minutes is not enough, inform us the difficulties and suggest a time. So I think that is just the worst scenario. So in the past, we never have such a scenario because I've already taken several rounds of that online examination on online tests. So there wouldn't be very big difficulties. But that's just in case that of this so-called scenario happen, you still have some way you can complete your exam and send us your results. There's a question being asked in the chat. Somebody asked, I think all of you are able to read that. The worst case is you get a COVID. No, it's not the worst case because we happen all the time. It's just just some kind of sickness. So in case you get ill and unable to take the exam, we already have some policy on that. You need to produce the medical certification on that. It's already the easiest with COVID because you must have some kind of reporting system. So in case you are not getting COVID, but you get sick, you need to get a doctor's certificate on that so that we can arrange a so-called makeup exam for you. So that is already some normal policy. So that's not the worst case. I think the worst case is your computers broke down, your internet broke down, and even your cell phone broke down, and you have no way you can communicate with us. I think that's the worst scenario. But I don't think it is very likely to happen. Maybe 1 in a million times. Okay, any question you would like to ask about the online examination? Nearly all of you have completed the practice examination. So I mean the use of lockdown browser. But there are, I think, until yesterday, still 2 of you haven't completed that. I won't chase them because it's at your own risk. I already made an announcement on that. So if you don't know how to install lockdown browser, and it so happened that you haven't completed the practice quiz, there's nothing I can do.
Dr. Yip?
Yes.
I have some questions.
Yes.
So question number 1. So as you said, the answers for the long answers supposed to be in a essay form. So yes. Do we need to have like introduction, conclusion, something like that to make it more like an essay, or just paragraph form? That's good enough.
So it depends on how you frame your answer, because I would say that every argument, you need to perhaps start with the context, the question you want to attempt. So you may call it introduction, but not to have introduction for the sake of introduction. So introduction is purposeful. So if you want to have to use some to let us know some context and what question you're going to answer, in what way you're going to frame your question, and that is something what we call introduction. But a general advice is that even if you need introduction, keep it short. Not to have introduction for the sake of introduction.
Okay.
It's the same approach will apply to conclusion, because you're answering the question so that you must something that conclude your argument. So that can be something what we call a conclusion. But again, as a general advice, keep the conclusion short and precise. Unlike in longer essays, because when you write an essay of 3,000 words, for instance, in your conclusion, perhaps you may have to have a few paragraphs of summary of what you have presented, what you argue. But that may not be necessary in the exam. Not because this is not useful, but because it's short. I would say that no one of you would be able to write 3,000 words or 4,000 words. You can only write, for instance, 800, 1,000 words. You don't need a summary of your argument, but perhaps you may need a conclusion and an explicit statement to answer the question. So that may be something you refer as conclusion. So in this sense, perhaps a conclusion is necessary, but it has to be precise. So there's another question. Font size suddenly change. No, the format, the structure wouldn't matter, because that only concern about your display. Because that the font you displays would have no impact on the information you store on the cloud. The cloud will only store the text, but not the format. So when I read your paper, it will be converted to the standard format of that display. So it's not your Word document. That's not a Word document, so don't worry. The font size is just your display. And I would say that to a certain extent, you can control that. But for some mysterious reason, it's out of control. But it doesn't matter. It will not affect your answer. Because when I read your answer, it will return to normal. Because we are not capturing the image of what you have written. We only store the text you have written. So don't worry. When will be recorded video of this lesson be uploaded? Why is important?
Can I continue? I have one more question.
Yes.
So question number 2. So in the notes that you sent us yesterday, as you have also mentioned just now, so we have this ID inspection during the exam.
Yes.
I wonder how the ID inspection work. Because usually in a physical venue, the invigilator will call up the student. Well, if not call up the student, we'll go to the student one by one. Then in the online section, how is this going to work?
We will call your name and you put your ID in front of the camera. Don't worry, because we have already solved the privacy issue, because we will invoke a function, what we call focus function in Zoom, so that all the students' screen will not have the capacity to look at other students' screen. So you appear as all blank, even if you turn on your camera. Only the invigilator will be able to see all those open screens. So you just put your ID in front of the camera when your name is being called upon.
Okay, then I guess it's not going to be that annoying that we will hear the invigilators asking students' name all the time. I guess that's not going to happen, right?
No. We will take turn to call your name. So when your name is being called upon, you show your ID card. And I think it's just 5 seconds. And then when the invigilator will confirm that they have checked your ID, and then you can pack your ID back. And we'll do it before the examination as soon as far as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Because that will be quick. That will be very quick. So we have 121 students. We are confident that we can check all the ID within 10 minutes. Because every time we will not call your name one by one. We may call upon 5 or 6 or even 8 students at one time, so that we can because we have a few invigilators, so we can check it very quickly. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah. And you are unable to see other people's ID because your screen will be all blank by that time. Only the invigilator have all those screens.
Right. Okay. That solves the problem. Thank you.
Yeah. Zoom help us to solve that problem, because that is also the problem many people asked in the past of the privacy issue. Okay, any other questions? I see no questions in the chat room. You can also turn on your mic and speak out. And before we end the sections, I have to alert those who do the last presentations, because we already set a deadline for your submission of papers. And that deadline cannot be extended. So even if you ask for extension, we are unable to give you an extension because perhaps you know that this year, our graduation, now we call it commencement, will be held in late May. So that we need to complete all the marking in mid-May, so that we can release your grade and calculate your GPA, and then to decide whether you are able to graduate or not. So we have a very strict deadline this year. So that's the reason why those extension, in fact, is already stretching the limit of us, because the deadline for this course, in fact, is much earlier than the deadline we have set for the paper. But because we understand that you need more time to do the paper because you have the exam in between. So that's why we give you a slightly more time on that. So this deadline would not be extended. So please take note of that for those who do the last topic. So if you do not have further questions, and perhaps I will see you next Friday. So perhaps finger crossed and good luck. So I'll see you next Friday in the examination. So in between, if you have any questions, send me an email. And I'll also try to put up the video recording of this section before the weekend, so that if you want to revisit some of the arrangement for the examination, you can still do that. Although what I have mentioned is already in the announcement. So perhaps you just read the announcement and it should be clear. Okay. If not, goodbye. And do some serious revision because the questions are not easy. Do have psychological preparation on that. All the questions are not easy. And I will also advise you to have some planning before you attempt the answer. And also don't be nervous. Don't be nervous. Okay, if not, goodbye.